Night of 27-28 of February 1943, Vemork, Telemark, Norway. Wind knifing across the Hardangervidda, -20 degrees. A waning moon painting the gorge in iron-blue light. Breath froze on balaclavas. Ski skins whispered over crusted snow. And far below the cliff line, the Norsk hydro plant hummed with the steady throb of electrolysis. Silence bit. The gorge around the empty Na River was a black wound in the white world. Its sides sheer, its bridge watched, its gates lit by harsh lamps that left cones of brilliance on the ice. Danger glowed. They had come by parachute and starvation and stubbornness. The advance party who survived the failed glider raid. The new team who carried the charges, meeting in a drifted hut and melting snow for tea before moving out under a sky of cold stars. Purpose narrowed. At 0100 hours, a luminous dial lifted in a gloved hand. Joachim Aran Nyberg's watch. A white circle trembling as the wind gnawed at the ridge, and the plant's windows flickered like embers below. Time thinned. They did not touch the guarded suspension bridge. Instead, they slid and crawled down into the ravine, buckles muffled, ropes hissing on ice, the smell of cold iron and spruce sap heavy in their noses. They chose the hard way. German sentries paced the road, boots crunching, rifles slung, breath clouding, their silhouettes striped by railings and wire. Eyes probed. On the far bank, the squad flattened beneath the plant's shadow and found the cable tunnel. A narrow artery cut into the rock, sealed with a simple chain and a padlock, more complacency than fortress. Weakness showed. A file rasped once, twice the chain sagged, and the door gritted open on darkness and warmth. Oil, steam, and the faint acid tang of lye, carried by a current of heated air from the cell room. They slipped inside. Below the turbine hall, the electrolysis cells sat like giant grey coffins in rows, pipes strapped in, gauges steady, hydrogen sighing as the process stripped water and left behind the heavy fraction the Germans needed for their reactor dreams. Necessity pulsed. They knew the space from drawings and memory, and a scientist's briefings in exile. The heavy water plant was unique, the only large-scale source in Europe. A quiet machine at the heart of a loud war. Pressure mounted. A Norwegian night watchman stumbled across two shadowed figures and froze. A whisper. A hand raised. A promise they would not harm him if he kept still. He nodded, eyes wide, and the intruders moved on while turbines thrummed overhead, conscience held. From rucksacks came the charges. Soft blocks of plastic explosive and pencil detonators laid out on the concrete like the tools of a careful surgeon. Fuses calibrated to seconds, not minutes, to keep the noise low and the odds survivable. Precision mattered. They worked fast under the pipes. Kneeling in puddles that steamed in the cold draft from the tunnel, binding charges to the critical manifolds, and cell connections. The metal skin slick with condensation, and the drone of production masking the sound of tape. Skill spoke. Sweat pooled inside mittens as they set the time pencils, acid nibbling a wire within the slim metal tubes, a tiny clock with no face that would, when it bit through, release a spring and strike the detonator. Fate ticked. In the corridor, one man watched the way back, boots ready to sprint, eyes counting the strides to the door while the others made final checks on each charge with gloved thumbs and a last, shared glance. No words needed. They set the delays short, seconds, not long enough for second thoughts, and turned away, moving through narrow light and shadow back toward the cable tunnel as the plant breathed around them like a sleeping animal. Exit came first. Behind them, metal shrieked and clanged. A dull, contained thump multiplied along the piping, valves rupturing, coolant hissing. Glass shattering in a ragged cascade as steam, and lye and the precious heavy fraction spilled to the floor drains, and away into the winter night. Hopes ruptured. Outside, The gorge gulped sound, and returned only the hiss of wind and the distant crackle of power lines, snow lifting in ghostly banners from the cliff edge as the saboteurs coiled ropes, shouldered skis, and slid into darkness. Escape began. Above the plant, lamps swung and boots ran and whistles cut the cold air while, beneath concrete and steel, the heart of a program faltered, not with a roar but with a cough, and the only large river of heavy water in Europe thinned to nothing. Arrogance slipped. By dawn the tracks on the plateau were already drifting shut, the Hardangervidda flattening all sign with its white hand as the German search parties fanned, and the survivors of the glider tragedy were remembered in silence by men who had just shifted the weight of a continent. Memory burned. They had entered where no army could march, they had broken what occupied Europe could not rebuild quickly, and they had left no corpses and no gunfire to trace them, only a crippled plant and a stunned garrison blinking at its own vulnerability. Belief cracked. In the unforgiving sky the cold sun rose over Telemark, and the empty Nez Gorge held the echoes of a short, precise night that cut a secret thread in Hitler's war. The Nazis had counted on heavy water. The Winter River counted down the seconds. Vemork did not begin as a battlefield. It began as a century's promise. 1911 concrete, steel penstocks, and the white roar of the Emtina River harnessed to make fertilizer for a hungry world. Industry breathed. In 1932, Harold Urey isolated heavy water, deuterium oxide D2O, and a quiet byproduct became a key to the atom's door. Curiosity sharpened. By 1934, Norsk Hydro's high-pressure electrolysis lines at Vemork could skim deuterium from ordinary water, cascading it up through stages toward purities that laboratories prized. A niche became a monopoly. When Germany occupied Norway in 1940, Berlin's physicists in the Uran-Varen, Heisenberg, Diebner, and their circle, stared at equations that needed a moderator for a sustained chain reaction, and they mistrusted graphite because boron impurities turned test piles cold. Heavy water became the chosen path. One source mattered. The Allies saw it too. That spring, French intelligence spirited away the existing stock. Barrels smuggled under cover of business rushed across borders as armies moved, while Britain folded the threat into its tube alloys file. Fear concentrated. Under occupation, Norsk Hydro's output expanded. Additional electrolysis cells, longer cascades, tighter controls, until Vemork was the only large-scale producer in Europe. Shipping drums stamped, deuterium oxide, under Wehrmacht guard. A bottleneck formed. The plant sat like a fortress above Rajukan, clinging to the mountainside, accessible by a single-lane suspension bridge and a steep, stair-stepped road, with a cable tunnel boring through rock to carry utilities. Geography favoured the defender. German troops ringed it with wire lights and patrols, their confidence reinforced by cliffs, snow, and a gorge that fell away like a trapdoor. Arrogance settled. In London, a Norwegian professor of electrochemistry, Dr. Leif Tronstad, late of Trondheim, now a technical brain inside SOE, laid out the stakes: destroy the electrolysis cells and the pipeline, and months of production would vanish. The brief was cold and exact. The first attempt came as Operation Freshman, November 1942. 2 Horsa gliders towed from Scotland, storm-tossed into Black Mountain weather, both crashing on the ice and rock of the Hardangervidda. Hope broke. Those who crawled from the wreckage were captured. Under Hitler's commando order, they were executed. The wind kept the only witness. 4 Norwegians, codename Grouse, later Swallow, were already on the plateau. Jens, Anton Poulsen, Arne Gelstrup, Klaus Hellberg, and Kynut Haugland. Their radio hidden in snow, their diet reduced to lichen oatmeal and the meat of a hunted reindeer. Endurance became a habit. They waited for a second team that winter, watched the moon phases and the patrol routines, and counted the plant's windows from high ground through a telescope wrapped in rags against the cold. Patience sharpened. The new team had a name, Gunnerside, and a leader, Joachim R. Nenneberg, 23, precise mountain bred, bringing with him Frederick Kaiser, Casper Eidland, Bergerstram Machim, and Hans Storhag, men who could ski in silence and make explosives talk softly. Youth carried steel. Across the water, the German nuclear program calculated chain lengths and neutron cross sections, the designations B piles, and Ranmaschine, scrawled in neat hands, while shipments of heavy water from Telemark were logged as strategic material. Theory needed liquid. The Americans, further west, had pivoted to ultra, pure graphite for their reactors, a solution their industrial weight could purify at scale. Plutonium and uranium paths split as rival strategies. Contrast was stark. For Germany without graphite, Vemork's heavy water was not merely helpful, it was foundational, the moderator that tamed fast neutrons into a thermal flow the reactor could sustain. One river fed one dream. Inside Soe's Baker Street. The plan matured land, link up, penetrate the electrolysis basement, cut the heart of the plant, and vanish into the plateau, avoiding civilian casualties if at all possible. The rules were simple. Ron Unneberg later said, "We regarded this mission as a one-way trip. A flat line delivered without drama that made the room, it was spoken in, feel smaller. Acceptance cooled the blood." Security reports from the garrison were confident. Mines on approaches, alarms on doors, bridge under watch, and the sheer geography lulled officers into believing no team could come up from the ravine in snow and darkness. Disbelief grew fat. Gunnerside's maps showed the alternative. A cable tunnel door on the far side, a maintenance passage that led like a vein into the cell room itself. Its lock an afterthought in a place where nature seemed guard enough. Weakness hid in plain sight. The stakes were not the destruction of a single building, but the euthanizing of a supply chain. Electrolytic stacks, compressors, and pipes that turned ordinary water into deuterium, rich stock at hundreds of kilograms per year. Time turned viscous. In Jukon's streets, Norwegian workers walked past German trucks with their eyes down, and at the plant an engineer's badge clicked a turnstile as turbines fed the electrolysis line's appetite for current. Normalcy wore a uniform. Above the gorge, two visions of the future faced each other, one in equations and scarcity, one in footstep, fuse, and the knowledge of how a cell is bolted together. Calculation met craft. The Germans laughed at climbing the bridge under machine guns. The saboteurs planned to flow beneath it like water. Pride misread the terrain, and as that winter deepened, with aurora smearing green over the plateau and ice bridging shallow pools into porcelain, the decision ripened in a hut half. Buried in snow enter, cut, and pour a year's hopes into a frozen river. A line was drawn. Vemork was a high-head symphony of steel and water, penstocks feeding turbines that spat out current like winter lightning into banks of electrolyzers, built to peel hydrogen from oxygen one bubble at a time. Power hummed. Deuterium oxide, D2O, was the slow, heavy fraction in that torrent, its atoms just fat enough to lag behind as ordinary hydrogen slipped away as gas. The isotope effect turning a fertilizer plant into a nuclear workshop. Weight mattered. Natural water holds deuterium at about 0.0156% by atoms, a whisper in a river, and the process trapped that whisper, stage after stage, until the concentrate grew dense enough to freeze at 3.8 GeC C and weigh about 10% more than the water around it. Science had a feel. Norsk Hydro's engineers arranged their electrolyzers in cascades, drawing off slightly enriched liquor at intervals, pumping it forward to higher stages, while sending depleted water back to feed the early cells, A patient ladder climbed in nickel and lye. The climb was quiet. Alkaline electrolyte, potassium hydroxide, kept the current flowing, plates and diaphragms were tuned for flow and wear, and the cell rooms smelled of warm oil, damp concrete, and a faint bite of caustic that lived in the back of the nose. The air pricked. Each cell was a creature of amperes and heat, jacketed pipes feeding coolant, gauge needles steady, relief valves perched like metal birds. The plant's heartbeat was hydrogen hissing into headers, while oxygen hissed the other way. The breath was even. At the far end of the line, the concentration stages were compact and unforgiving. The smallest inventory, the highest purity, the fewest spares, where a well-placed charge could turn months of careful enrichment into hot, useless scrap in a blink. Fragility showed. German doctrine guarded the obvious, the single-lane bridge, the gate, the switchback road, floodlights and wire, sentries whose boots sounded like metronomes on frozen gravel. Assumptions froze. The cable tunnel on the ravine side was an engineer's convenience. A rock-bored artery for power and services. Its door neglected for war, because the cliff itself looked like a wall. Blindness hardened. The door was locked only with a chain and a padlock. Joachim R. Nunneberg said later, the memory offered flatly, as if describing a barn in summer, instead of the hinge of a continent's secret hopes. Understatement cut. SOE's Norwegian section shaped its doctrine around bottlenecks. Strike what the enemy can least replace, avoid casualties, leave a puzzle instead of a battle, and let the landscape do the killing if pursuit comes. Cold did the rest. Training at Glenmore Lodge and Scottish Rangers had honed small hands to big results. Rope over rock, ski on crust, compass at night, and the soft arithmetic of charges and fuses assembled on a crate under blackout. Discipline smelled of cordite and wet wool. The tools were chosen for silence. Plastic explosive, stable in freeze, moldable under the palm. Detonators cradled in gloved fingers. Time pencils whose tiny ampoules ate a wire until a spring struck a cap with the dry tick of fate. Delay became destiny. Time pencils were treacherous in Telemark's cold. Delays lengthened as mercury collapsed and chemistry slowed. And the saboteurs warmed the switches inside their clothes and under their arms before setting them. Braith fogged. They did not aim to blast the building into a crater. They aimed to cut the plant's arteries. The manifolds, the feed lines between stages, the joints that tied the final cells together, so that pressure and purity collapsed in the same second. Precision was mercy. The cascade's logic meant that wrecking the high, purity end would starve every stage below it of purpose. The heavy fraction would be flushed, the drums would go unfilled, and the German shipments would stall at the source. A chain broke link by link. Barrels left Vemork stenciled in neat letters. Deuterium oxide, 99.75 cent, and travelled under guard by rail and ferry through Rogercan and across Tinsager, before heading to Germany, marching orders for a liquid moderator. Labels whispered. To the physicists of the Uranverein, Heisenberg and colleagues, the moderator was the tamer of neutrons, slowing them to thermal pace so uranium could sustain a chain reaction inside a lattice of cubes bathed in heavy water. Theory needed stillness. Germany had rejected graphite after early tests failed from boron impurities. The Allies, with wider industry, purified graphite until it sang. But Berlin's path ran through Telemark's turbines and electrolyzers like a single cable to the future. Choices narrowed. Inside the cell room, the saboteurs' charges were placed not for spectacle but for function. On flanges where shock would shear bolts. On thin-walled sections where blast would tear a mouth. On valves whose destruction would drown the whole array in its own chemistry. Targeting became anatomy. Their weapons were a last resort. their Sten guns stripped, oiled thin for the cold, magazines checked. Safety's safe, because doctrine said this was a surgeon's job, not a firefight, and silence would be half the victory. Metal stayed shy. The machine's character was stubborn. Electrolyzers that could be replaced. Pipes that could be rerun. Tanks that could be rewelded. But its vulnerability was time, the long, cumulative climb from river to reactor that could not be rushed. Time was the wound. Across the gorge, the hydropower station that had once been the largest in the world when built in 1911 fed this secret economy of isotopes. Each kilowatt, hour a shove up the enrichment ladder that war had leaned against a different wall. History echoed in concrete. In that context, the charges were arguments as much as explosions. Assertions that a high technology path can hinge on a padlock and a presumption, and that a machine, however grand, inherits the blind spots of its makers. Pride met physics, and when the fuses burned within their brass jackets and springs snapped, the machine exhaled wrong. The hiss became a scream, the pressure became wreckage, and the cascade became a river again racing toward the drains. Sound told the truth. 28 February 1943, a few minutes past 0100 hours. Vemork's electrolysis basement. Steam ghosted from warm pipes into cold air, while the turbines above beat a steady, industrial thunder. The plant breathed as if safe. A gloved hand tested a flange with a surgeon's pressure. Another held a pencil fuse cupped in cloth, warmed palms, and the concrete sweated a caustic tang that stung the back of the throat. Nerves tasted metal. They had come up from the ravine, ice in their beards and rope burns hidden under wool, following the cable tunnel like a vein toward the heart they meant to sever. The hard way had opened. The door was locked only with a chain and a padlock. Joachim Armer Nemberg would say later, and incredulity preserved in calm syllables that outlived the war, complacency had a sound. A night watchman, Norwegian, stepped from shadow into the corridor's yellow light and froze at the sight of strange fur caps and Sten silhouettes, his breath lifting in small clouds as turbines purred above. Humanity stood in the way. We were very happy that we didn't have to kill anyone. Avneberg remembered decades later to the BBC, the relief as clear as the memory. Mercy held its line. Past him the final stage cell bank lay squat and purposeful, gauges steady, valves ticking. The place where water's heavy whisper became a usable voice. This was the bottleneck. Plastic explosive came out in soft bricks, moulded to manifolds and thin, walled sections, tape whispering as it tightened, hands moving with the economy of men who had rehearsed by candle on a Scottish floor. Skill wore silence. Time pencils were fickle in the telemark cold. They warmed them under their clothing and bit open ampoules, letting acid start its invisible work against a coiled wire. Chemistry became a clock. Y regarded this mission as a one-way trip. Arne Berg had admitted beforehand. Words that now lived in the flex of his fingers, and the steadiest breath he could pull past the lie sting. Acceptance steadied the wrist. He checked each placement with a thumbprint, nodded once, and slid the last charge under a pipe that hummed faintly with the passage of hydrogen. To wreck a cascade, you cut the arteries, not the skin. Anatomy guided force. They set delays short. Half a minute measured in the mind against the length of a corridor and the weight of a door. And stepped back into the corridor, where the watchman stared as if he'd seen a ghost wearing skis. Seconds grew teeth. Boots kissed concrete in a near run, muffled webbing tight to cloth. The cable tunnel door swallowing them into a draught that smelled of rock, dust and oil. Behind, the plant kept breathing as if the future belonged to it. Pride still hummed. A dull, compact thump walked the length of the cell room, multiplied into tearing metal, shearing bolts. and the wet scream of ruptured lines as high-purity liquor, and lye went everywhere at once. Glass went like ice in a stove. Quiet died fast. Pressure spiked, and then vanished, gauges falling to zero, as if someone had cut the strings of a puppet. Heavy water that took months to coax up the ladder raced instead to floor drains and out toward the frozen dark. Inventory became runoff. Above, a sentry's boots slammed into a run, a whistle cut the air, and bells began a jittering cry through corridors, suddenly fogged with steam. The gorge swallowed as much sound as it could. Chaos met cold. Outside, the wind poured at coats as ropes hissed over rock and skis found their lines, the men flattening into the mountain's black crease, with the practiced certainty of people who trusted gradient more than luck. Escape had a slope. In the electrolysis basement, light found torn metal, and a padlock on the floor like a bad joke. When officers arrived with pistols and clipped orders, they stared at the absence of gunfire and the presence of precision. Invulnerability looked small. A SOEs after action assessments would note the core facts. Final concentration destroyed, about 500 kilograms of product lost. No casualties among the saboteurs. But paper could not capture the burnt, alkali stink and the way steam condensed on lashes. Reports missed the taste. Search parties fanned along the plateau by dawn, skis squeaking on cold snow, dogs whining where the wind tangled scent, and patrols threw flares into a sky already paling at 20 below. Pursuit found only weather. The men of gunnerside broke into echelons, some folding back into the Hardanger Vidda to harry and vanish, others driving east across 300 kilometers of snow toward Sweden with frost. Burnt faces and a story they would not tell until it was safe. Endurance turned into distance. What they left behind was a working myth, shattered a fortress, plant whose cliff and bridge had seemed like a spell, undone by a maintenance door and a belief that winter itself stood guard. Arrogance met a padlock. At Rojukan the garrison inventoried wreckage, interviewed a shaken watchman, and looked out over a river that had swallowed the most precious liquid in Europe without remark. The steel had not failed them so much as certainty had. Disbelief stood in boots. In the unforgiving sky above Telemark, morning hardened the snow to glass as the turbines kept turning, and the cascade lay dead, and a thought filtered through the headquarters shock, like meltwater through icy. If this was possible, nothing was safe. The spell had broken.